Hello and welcome to the Word on the Street's February Book of the Month feature. We're very excited to be featuring two books from two great authors this month. Joining us today in conversation are Jael Richardson, the author of The Stone Thrower, a book columnist on CBC's Q, and the founder and executive director for the Festival of Literary Diversity in Brampton, Ontario. Her debut novel, Gutter Child, is a dystopian tale of courage and resilience and arrived January 2021 with HarperCollins Canada. We're also joined by Amanda Leduc, a writer and disability rights advocate. She's the author of The Centaur's Wife, published with Random House Canada this month, as well as Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability and Making Space, and The Miracles of Ordinary Men. Her essays and stories have appeared across Canada, the US, and the UK, and she has spoken across North America on accessibility, inclusion, and disability in storytelling. She has cerebral palsy and lives in Hamilton, Ontario, where she serves as the communications coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, Canada's first festival for diverse authors and stories. We're so excited to have you both here this month, so please take it away.
Okay, well, this is fun. I mean, Amanda and I get to chat regularly throughout the week for our work at Fold, but this is the first time we just are talking books.
How does it feel, friend?
Oh, that's the number one question, and I have no answer. So I'm feeling good talking to you. That makes me feel comfortable. And I know we've had lots of chats about our book. I love that they picked two books for the shortest month of the year. I feel like that's particularly cruel and kind at the same time. But
definitely kind.
But I thought maybe we'll start with a little bit about how our book came about, because let's start with you, because last year you had Disfigured come out, which was just wonderfully successful, a beautiful book. And then you have this novel that comes out that I know you're working on at the same time. There's certainly whispers of some themes in both. So how did you actually start The Centaur's Wife?
So The Centaur's Wife actually was started first. So I was working on it before I actually conceived of the idea for Disfigured. The Centaur's Wife comes out of a short story that I wrote and published in 2014, actually. And so I'd been working on it all this time, and sort of, how books reveal layers of themselves to you as you're going along. I realized about maybe, let's say, 4 years into working on it that it definitely had a very clear disability angle, and that the protagonist was disabled. And I was sort of, wrestling with that and how I wanted to portray that. And long story short, the book was actually supposed to come out in 2018, and it kept getting pushed back because it just wasn't ready. And then the idea for Disfigured came to me in 2018, and I was working on that, starting to work on that. And then writing that book and working through the issues in that book put me in a really good place to finally finish The Centaur's Wife. And it really, looking back on it now, feels like I needed to write Disfigured first in order for The Centaur's Wife to become the book that it was meant to be, which I think is always really interesting, because I think as you write, you're sort of, Sheila Heti has talked about this before, where you're kind of becoming the person that you need to be in order to finish the novel, which I think is really great, because it also applies really well to you, which I know, from our conversations that we've had over the last 5-6 years, as we've both been writing these novels. And how do you think that applies to you in terms of, your process of writing Gutter Child and sort of what it started as and what it became? How was that for you?
I mean, I can't imagine writing a book on top of another book. That to me is like a brain space I just don't have.
I had it either.
Not for me. I mean, basically, my process has been thus far, as soon as I submit a manuscript, I the final one, the edits are all done. That's when I know what the next project is, and not a minute earlier. I kind of have whisperings and ideas, but I can't really tell what I'm supposed to work on or what I'm going to be working on until the previous manuscript is done and in. So I was working on Stone Thrower, the memoir about my dad, and researching his life and where he grew up. And there's this moment when I was working on the book and we were making a documentary about it, that we went to his hometown and we walked into the projects where he had grown up. And there was a man who was about my age who was like, "Hey, Chuck, you must know my mom. And he went into this thing about how he and my mom, his mom and my dad used to live close to one another. And when I left that conversation, when I left that moment, I kept thinking about the fact that this man was the same age as me. And yet he was living a life that was entirely different than the one I had experienced. And that, he was growing up in the projects. He was home in the middle of the day, which meant he either didn't have a job or he was doing shift work, which very different from the kind of experience I had growing up. And so I was just stuck on this question of like, why that happens, how that happens, what might have been different for his mom than it was for my dad. And that was when I finished Stone Thrower, the question that kept haunting me was that one. And the question of like, what happens when you grow up in a world designed for your failure? And how does it differ for women than it does for men, for example? And so that was really what led to Gutter Child. And I think I'm curious to know from you about, choosing an imagined world. Like for me, dystopia felt like the best possible place to go after writing nonfiction, because it's just like no rules. I can literally make everything up. Do I want it to be like Chicago? I can make that up. Do I want it to be like, Jamaica? I can make that, I can make it whatever I want it to be. And that felt so freeing after being so rooted in nonfiction. So what was it that made you want to pick sort of an imagined world to set the story in?
I think so, when I was growing up as a baby writer, going to university and, studying to be a writer in Canada, there was a real, so this would have been, 15, 16 years ago. There was a real at that time focus on realist fiction. And I tried really hard to write realist stories. And, I did, but my heart really wasn't in it. And in my last year of undergrad, so in 2005, I wrote a story about an angel, which eventually became The Miracles of Ordinary Men, my first book. And everybody in workshop responded really well to it. And it felt really freeing. Like it just this sense of suddenly like, oh no, actually I can write stories and maybe even a book that, are not necessarily grounded in reality, that have very unrealistic elements. And it was just, it felt very, it just felt really liberating in a way that was really exciting for me. And I think this is interesting. There was an article in the Toronto Star that came out earlier in January with you, and it was talking about how when you were writing your nonfiction, that, like you say, feeling kind of not bogged in the research, but just, you sort of go through it and then it's like, okay, I want to do something that's totally made up. And there was an element of that for me, especially, finishing Disfigured and then going back into The Centaur's Wife, contrasting those kinds of freedoms where you're like, anything can happen and it's up to me. And it's just about creating a world that the reader believes in some way. So, that kind of world building is all centered around believability, these characters that, do these actions that kind of carry the plot through. And so I think, for me, the interesting part about my research in Disfigured and moving from that to a novel was that the research actually became very integral to the way that I approach my sort of fabulist. I don't like to use the term magic realism because I know it doesn't necessarily apply to me, not as a writer of color, but the fabulist sort of elements of my book, I find doing research into real world things that can then be sort of blown open and, you sort of understand the sort of basic standards of something or the basic points of something and then twist it whichever way you want, make what you can of those research points that and then build an entirely different world from them. That was really exciting. So, I could take kind of the world that we knew. It's a world that's recognizable as ours, but then also, there are centaurs running around and there are stories about other beasts that, once roamed the world. And it was so fascinating to me in reading your book because I feel like there's a lot of that same thing going on, right? Where it's a world we can recognize so many of the elements of it. And yet it's a world that, is very, I want to say very different from ours in particular ways, and also very, very, very similar in the ways in which it explores the structures that kind of constrain people, right? And so how was that dance for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most fun part about writing dystopia is that you can do anything. There's just no rules, and that feels really liberating. And I really enjoyed that. It was also the hardest thing, though, about writing the book, I think, in terms of when you can do anything, it becomes really difficult to decide like what not to do, what to do, how much information, how little.
Yeah.
You know, there was a question for me about the backstory and like when it comes in and how it comes in. And I remember reading a whole bunch of dystopias to see how they unraveled the backstory of the world, if they did. And so that was, I think, the hardest thing for me. And it's not too much of a spoiler to say this, but there's sort of 3 locations, 4 if you get creative, one, you know, that's mentioned. And so I actually felt like I had to build 4 worlds. And that was stressful because you had to make the rules for each setting and then make sure you didn't break the rules in ways that wouldn't be believable. So I think for me, dystopia was both the most exciting part of it, creating, making, inventing, but also the most difficult part because in the editing process, I had to really nail down what's said, what's not said, when it's said, how much is said. And that was always like, do I cut this? Do I keep this? Is it needed? Can I take it out?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you've done this before. This is my first novel, but this is your second. What was it? Was there something that was particularly difficult about this one that was different from Miracles? Or same stress? Same stress.
It was all difficult, Jael. It was from the beginning to the end. Yeah. I don't know. You know, I've talked about this before in other interviews. I feel like writing a novel, I mean, writing a book just in general, but for me, a novel in very particular ways is like building a house. And you finish one novel and you think, great, I've built a house. I know how to build a house now. And then you go to write another novel and you're building a house, yes, but suddenly you're building a house with entirely different materials. So, you know, first you built a house, you know, Fables, 3 Little Pigs. First you build a house made of straw and you're like, yes, I've got this straw building house down. And then you go to build another house and it's built of sticks. And suddenly you have to think about how the sticks interweave in a way that's totally different from building your straw house. And so it's like, you know, the process, but you also have to learn the process all over again in the writing. And The Centaur's Wife was quite emotionally not difficult. It was harder, I think, than I had anticipated because it took a lot personally out of me. You know, I wanted it to be a book about desire when I was first writing it. It ended up being a book about grief and how desire and grief are intertwined. And there was a lot of personal stuff that was sort of happening in my own life while I was writing it that kind of became mirrored in the book in very particular ways for me. And that was difficult, like running through all of that while I was writing. I think when I was writing my first novel, I was a little bit more, it felt a little bit more cerebral in a way that, you know, I think was actually very important to the book that The Miracles of Ordinary Men turned out to be. This one felt a lot messier. In a way that I think was good. I think it challenged me as a writer, and I definitely have learned a lot from the writing of it. So I'm very grateful to that process, and I'm grateful to that book for, you know, really waiting to become the book that it needed to be. I think, you know, there can really be, especially now when there's this pressure to, you know, always have content out there and always have a book and always remain relevant by having a book. I think there's a real pressure to just be putting stuff out all the time and rushing things through. And I'm really, really grateful to my editor, Anne Collins at Random House Canada, who was really, really good about sort of, you know, really pushing the book to go where it needed to go. I'm happy to wait for how long it took for it to get there. But I have a question for you in terms of writing the book. How was it for you writing a book, writing your first novel, while also working full-time and putting a festival on?
Well, you were doing the same thing. I mean,
yeah, I know,
we were both doing it.
Your experience mirrors my experience.
I think more than the fold, like to me, working on the fold is like, I don't know. it comes quite naturally for me most of the time. Like most of the process is quite fun and enjoyable. Certain parts of it are more difficult and more cumbersome than others, but generally speaking, it provides me with a lot of life and energy and a lot of connection with people that writing just doesn't. Writing is an exceptionally lonely task, and I both love that and hate that about writing. So Fold provides me with like the balance I think I need. I think what was harder was writing it in the midst of all these like social crises that were happening, some of which were relevant to the book. I went through like a faith crisis, I would say, of some sort. I wouldn't say a crisis as in like I abandoned my faith, but I think I was really struggling with what the faith community was doing to other people and the lack of activism and effort. And so I think one of the things that happens when you're writing a book like this is you when it's so much a part of your life, you find a way to work it into your writing, or it finds a way to work into your writing. I don't know which one, but so that was definitely part of it. I think even I was finishing the book about a year ago, and through the George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery stories that were really popular in the news, along with Canadian stories. And so I was very much trying to figure out, I'd written this book over 8 years and I had changed dramatically, I feel like, over those 8 years. And so I was trying to figure out what the original intention was of the book was and what the end journey needed to be for the book, how it might need to change from what it was originally intended to be and do, and how it, I should just like not tear it all up and start over again at the same time. So there was a lot of that probably provided the most difficulty. I mean, there was logistics involved in working on the Fold and working on the book. There's sort of the time. How do you split your time? How do you make that work? But I think most writers have to figure out that kind of a divide. For me, it was more the social and spiritual things that I was going through that really found their way into the book as questions as well, right? The book started for me with a question about what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure. And then inside there were also smaller questions about that. What does a faith-based community do in response to that? How do different kinds of people respond to that kind of pressure? And what does that say about us as a community? For me, thinking specifically about the Black community. So those were, that was the big hurdle in my life.
I'm thinking back to this time last year when we were both like just on the cusp of sort of handing in finished manuscripts. Mm-hmm. I think that I tweeted at one point and I was like, there was some profanity in the tweet I will not repeat here. It was just like, I am never, ever, ever, ever writing a novel ever again. And of course, in the tweet itself, I was like, well, this is an obvious, terrible lie because, not other novels will come. But yeah, there definitely was a point when we were both in that same place. Yeah. Where we were both like, never again. No.
Never again. And then also like a year from now, we were like, never again. We were planning a normal in-person festival in May. And like a month after that point where we had submitted our manuscript, like the world went to poop. And so, it's interesting to write dystopias that are addressing catastrophe and social justice and, all these things that we're talking about in our work. And then to have the whole world like turn into a dystopia. It is a bizarre time to write.
In very particular ways that highlight the issues that we've been, the specific issues that we're highlighting in our books, right? That's definitely been an experience.
Well, and I think this is a good point to sort of wrap up in terms of saying, like, we have a lot more. I know we have a lot more that we could say about all these things. And thankfully, there is room for more. So I want to just do, as we wrap up, just a little bit of a plug for both of us. We're actually going to be doing an event with Another Story Bookshop. I think you'll see a slide at the end of this conversation. We're going to be doing an event with Another Story Bookshop. And it is February 23rd at 8 p.m. Is that right? And Thea Lim's going to moderate it. It's called Brave New Worlds. And we'll be talking more about the world building and about the stories. And so if you haven't already got our books, Gutter Child and The Centaur's Wife are available in bookstores now. You can order them. You can listen to them. You can read them on an ebook. However you want to read them, you can get them. And you can watch the piece on Another Story Bookshop, HarperCollins, and Random House Canada on February 23rd. If you're watching this after February 23rd, or if something else is going on the 23rd, what else would be going on? You can watch it on the Another Story Bookshop page. They're going to be posting a recording of the video as well, so you can catch us that way.
And if I can just say too, the video will have captions for those of you who may require them. And if I may also do just another plug, The Centaur's Wife is actually going to be available, is available now, in a variety of accessible formats as well. So Disfigured came out in accessible formats last year, and The Centaur's Wife is also available in a variety of accessible formats. So if you go to CELA Library, that's CELA library.ca, you should be able to, if you're a reader with print disabilities, you'll be able to get your hands on a copy.
Awesome. Well, we'll talk soon, Amanda.
Yes, indeed we will.
Maybe at work, but
Maybe.
Also in a few days.
See you then.
See you then.